Hürtgen Forest, Western Germany, November 1944. The morning mist is heavy, almost alive, swallowing the trees in a gray silence. Then it begins, a distant rumble, like thunder crawling across the earth. Seconds later, the world erupts. A single American battery opens fire. 155 Afihanapimata shells scream overhead, tearing through the fog, smashing into the German lines hidden beneath the pines. The ground heaves, trees split apart like matchsticks, and the air fills with dirt, splinters, and terror. German soldiers huddle in makeshift bunkers carved into wet soil. Helmets rattle on trembling heads. Some pray. Others sit motionless, staring into the shaking walls, waiting for it to end. But it doesn't. For hours, the sky rains steel. Communication lines vanish, trenches collapse. Commanders can't even raise their heads to shout an order. Entire platoons are swallowed by the bombardment without ever seeing the enemy. And when the shelling stops, silence feels like a lie. The only sound left is the dull echo of men surrendering. Hands raised, faces blank, not from defeat, but from relief. Because in that forest, death by shellfire had become worse than capture. The question is, how did it come to this? By the autumn of 1944, the war in Western Europe had reached a brutal crossroads. The Allies had stormed ashore at Normandy in June, shattered German defenses across France through the summer, and now pressed against the western borders of the Reich itself. But the closer they came to Germany, the more vicious the fighting became. For the German Wehrmacht, there was no longer a front, only a slow retreat, a desperate crawl back toward a homeland being consumed by flames. Supply lines were broken, fuel was scarce, and the Luftwaffe had been driven from the skies. Yet Hitler's orders were unyielding: hold every inch of ground. His generals obeyed, not out of faith, but fear. In this collapsing empire, one thing defined the new face of the war: artillery. American divisions advancing across France had discovered that their true strength was not in tanks or infantry, but in the overwhelming coordination of their guns. Every U.S. Army Corps carried with it an orchestra of destruction: 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers, long-range guns, and mobile artillery battalions capable of firing thousands of rounds a day. Unlike their German counterparts, U.S. artillery units were rarely isolated or blind. They had radios, field telephones, signal wire teams, and forward observers who could direct fire with astonishing speed. When a rifle company encountered resistance, the call for fire took minutes, not hours. And when it came with precision. A wall of steel that seemed to move with the infantry, covering every approach, every counterattack. By September 1944, entire German formations had come to dread the sound of American shells. Reports from Wehrmacht field units describe men refusing to hold positions under bombardment. They wrote of drum fire so dense that no living thing could survive above ground. Others spoke of the whispering death, the eerie delay between the firing of U.S. batteries and the sudden annihilation of their trenches. The Allies had not merely caught up with Germany's famed artillery arm, they had surpassed it. Logistics made the difference. The U.S. Army's supply network could feed ammunition into the front lines faster than the Germans could react. Railheads, truck convoys, and depots stretched back across liberated France, moving millions of shells through the famous Red Ball Express. Where the Germans had to ration every round, the Americans could afford to blanket an entire forest for a single objective. The effect was psychological as much as physical. Veterans of both sides later described the sensation of American firepower as something more than human. To the soldiers trapped beneath it, it felt mechanical, detached, unending, like the hand of an invisible god. You could not fight it, one captured German infantryman said after the Hürtgen battles. You could only wait for it to stop. In these months, the U.S. Army refined a doctrine that would become legendary: time on target. Multiple batteries, spread across miles, would calculate trajectory and distance so that every shell arrived simultaneously. The result was annihilation before the enemy could even seek cover. The first round and the last would strike together, flattening command posts, artillery nests, and bunkers in a single coordinated instant. German divisions, already under strength and short of supplies, began to crumble. Commanders complained to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht that American artillery coordination defies countermeasures. Every attempt to regroup or counterattack was cut to pieces before it could begin. By late 1944, this imbalance defined the Western Front. For every German gun, the Americans had 5. For every shell the Germans fired, the Allies answered with 50. But the coming months would show that this was not merely a tactical advantage. It was the weapon that would break the psychological backbone of the Wehrmacht. In the thick woods of the Hurtgen and the frozen plains of the Ardennes, German soldiers would learn that surrender was not just survival. It was escape from a storm no human could endure. And that storm was about to reach its most devastating crescendo. By late November 1944, the Allied advance had slowed to a brutal grind. The Siegfried Line, Germany's last defensive belt before the Rhine, stood ahead, fortified with pillboxes, minefields, and dense forests that nullified air power and tank mobility. The region between Aachen and the Roer River became a nightmare. The Hurtgen Forest Campaign. The forest was supposed to be a short operation, a few weeks at most. Instead, it became one of the most punishing battles the U.S. Army would ever fight. Rain turned the ground to sludge. Fog clung to the trees, blinding visibility. Every movement was watched, every trail zeroed in by German mortars and snipers. But even the most fanatical defenders of the Reich soon discovered they were not fighting men. They were fighting artillery. The U.S. Army turned the forest into an experiment in annihilation. Hundreds of howitzers were in place just beyond the tree line. Forward observers sat perched in shattered towers, calling in strikes with clinical precision. When American infantry encountered resistance, they did not flank. They leveled it. Shell after shell rained down until nothing remained but broken branches and silence. The German 275th and 353rd Infantry Divisions suffered catastrophic losses. Many of their men were not killed in combat, but buried alive under collapsed bunkers. Artillery had stripped away the illusion of defensive warfare. There was no trench deep enough, no pillbox strong enough. Reports from the front described units disappearing without contact. Commanders noted that soldiers began surrendering en masse rather than attempt to endure another bombardment. Across the line, American officers began to notice the same phenomenon. The moment shelling began, German communications ceased. Even elite paratrooper regiments, hardened in Italy and Normandy, would break formation and scatter into the woods. Some tried to run, others simply waited for capture. But the Hurtgen was only a prelude. In December 1944, the German High Command launched its final counteroffensive in the west, the Battle of the Bulge. The Ardennes offensive was a gamble of desperation, an attempt to split the Allied front and capture Antwerp. At first it worked. Poor weather grounded Allied aircraft, and German armored columns cut deep into the American lines. But once the skies cleared, the story changed overnight. American artillery, now supported by radar and coordinated air reconnaissance, became the decisive factor. For every German tank that rolled through the snow, American gunners responded with calculated precision. When forward observers spotted movement, the response was immediate. Entire road junctions disappeared under barrages. German supply convoys were obliterated before reaching the front. Inside their foxholes, German infantry could hear it long before it arrived. The steady ripple of American guns firing in sequence. Then, the whistling descent that no soldier could predict. Men would freeze in terror, counting the seconds until impact. There was no defense, no pattern to learn. The artillery seemed to know exactly where they were. By January 1945, As the bulge collapsed, American divisions advanced again, crossing the Ruhr, pushing toward the Rhine. The German army was no longer retreating strategically. It was disintegrating. Entire formations surrendered without firing a shot, their officers citing the impossibility of holding ground under American fire. The culmination would come in March and April. The Ruhr Pocket, a vast industrial region, trapped between the Rhine and the advancing Allied armies, became a death trap for Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model. Over 300,000 German soldiers were encircled. Short on food, fuel, and ammunition, they dug into defensive positions, but against the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies, resistance was hopeless. For the Americans, it was a test of precision warfare on a continental scale. Corps-level artillery networks blanketed the Ruhr with fire. Every road, every bridge, every patch of open ground was mapped and pre-sighted. German units that tried to move at night were caught by radar-directed fire. Convoys disappeared within minutes. The survivors called it der Feuerhagel, the hail of fire. It wasn't chaos. It was calculated destruction. And within days, tens of thousands of soldiers, battered, starving, deafened by weeks of bombardment, began walking out of their trenches with white cloths tied to their rifles. They weren't beaten in battle. They were broken by artillery. War historians often describe artillery as the god of battle. But in the final months of the Second World War, on the Western Front, it became something more than divine. It became industrialized fate. To understand why 50,000 German soldiers surrendered rather than face it, we must look beyond the smoke and explosions and examine the machinery, doctrine, and precision that made American artillery the most feared force in Europe. The tactical angle, coordination as a weapon. Every U.S. division was built around fire coordination. Infantry, tanks, engineers, and reconnaissance units all operated as the eyes of the guns. When a patrol encountered resistance, the first instinct wasn't to charge, it was to call in coordinates. Field phones and radios connected platoons directly to artillery liaison officers stationed miles behind the line. These officers could summon an entire battalion's worth of fire within minutes. In an age before digital computers, American gunners mastered complex ballistic calculations with astonishing speed and accuracy, using slide rules, firing tables, and pre-calibrated range data. This wasn't luck. It was organization, a triumph of logistics and communication. The Germans, fighting with fractured chains of command and dwindling supplies, could rarely coordinate their guns effectively. Their artillery doctrine, once formidable in 1940, had fallen behind by 1944. They lacked fuel to move heavy batteries, copper for shell casings, and trucks for ammunition transport. In contrast, the U.S. Army's logistical network functioned like a living organism. Shells flowed constantly from depots in France and Belgium to the frontline batteries, an uninterrupted artery of steel. Tactically, this meant that any concentration of German troops, armor, or supply columns could be obliterated in under 5 minutes. U.S. forward observers, often perched in church towers, forests, or reconnaissance aircraft, provided real-time targeting adjustments. Even the weather could not save the defenders. Radar-assisted fire control allowed American guns to hit targets through fog, rain, or darkness. One after-action report from the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division described the result with chilling simplicity. The enemy never counterattacked twice from the same position. Once located, that position ceased to exist. For the Germans, this was not warfare. It was erasure. The technological angle. Precision through innovation. The secret behind this supremacy wasn't just numbers. It was science. By 1944, the U.S. Army had developed one of the most sophisticated artillery command systems in history. Fire Direction Centers, FDCs, acted as nerve hubs. Each one received reports from forward observers, triangulated positions, and relayed firing solutions to multiple batteries simultaneously. This created a synchronized network of destruction. When an order was given for time on target, dozens of guns fired from different locations, adjusting their charges and angles so that every shell, regardless of distance, arrived on the target at the exact same second. The effect was catastrophic. Defenders could not take cover in time, and survivors often described the initial wave as a single explosion that filled the world. Technology also gave the Americans another critical advantage: mobility. Self-propelled artillery like the M7 Priest and the M12 gun motor carriage allowed fire support to move with the armored spearheads. As the infantry advanced, the guns rolled forward, establishing new fire bases within hours. In contrast, German heavy artillery was largely static. Guns like the 88 mm and 150 mm howitzers were powerful but slow to relocate. Once pinned, they were either abandoned or destroyed. American artillery also benefited from superior ammunition production. High-explosive HE shells were mass-manufactured with precision fuses that could be adjusted for ground bursts, delayed penetration, or air bursts, the latter being especially lethal against entrenched infantry. Air burst shells detonated just above the ground, raining molten fragments downward in a deadly cone. Even soldiers inside bunkers could not escape the shock waves. By 1945, the U.S. Army had added a new layer of lethality: proximity fuses. Using miniature radar sensors, these shells exploded automatically when near a target, increasing effectiveness by nearly 70%. German soldiers called them Wundergranaten, miracle shells, and believed they defied physics. The result of all this innovation was terrifying predictability. If the Americans saw you, they could hit you. If they hit you, you didn't survive. Tactics and technology together forged an environment where resistance became meaningless. Every attempt by German infantry to maneuver, resupply, or even communicate drew fire. Platoon leaders described radio operators being killed mid-sentence, command posts vanishing before they could relocate, and machine gun nests silenced before they fired a single burst. In the words of one U.S. artillery officer from the Ninth Army, "We didn't just stop the enemy, we erased the concept of attack itself." This is where the calculus of surrender began, not as a moral collapse, but as a recognition of reality. To fight was suicide, to endure was madness. And as the barrages intensified through the winter of 1944 and spring of 1945, the German High Command began to notice something new in their reports: not just casualties, but disappearances. Entire battalions lost contact. Their men later found wandering in shock, deaf, disoriented, some with no visible wounds at all. The Americans had discovered not just how to destroy armies, but how to dismantle human will. That was the battlefield of the Ruhr. Not just a clash of steel, but a confrontation between endurance and the unbearable weight of firepower. If the first half of this story was about machinery and doctrine, the second half is about humanity. The faces beneath the helmets, the men who endured the storm, and the commanders who learned that war could be won without ever seeing the enemy. The human angle. Living under fire. For the average German infantryman, life on the Western Front in early 1945 was a nightmare lived in seconds. They slept in damp earth, ate cold rations when they could, and never lit fires, not for warmth, not for light. The fear wasn't of American soldiers, it was of being seen. One sighting meant coordinates. Coordinates meant death. Survivors spoke of a kind of dread that no training could prepare them for. The shriek of incoming shells had its own language. Those who had survived long enough could tell the caliber by ear. The deep roar of a 150 mm howitzer was distinct from the sharp crack of the 105, but there was no comfort in familiarity. The sound meant only one thing: death was arriving again. Corporal Hans K., serving with the 116th Panzer Division during the Ruhr fighting, recalled, "You would press your body into the earth until you thought you would sink into it. When it stopped, you didn't move. You didn't speak. You just waited for the next one. There was no courage under such fire, only endurance, and even that had limits." Commanders found themselves losing men not through wounds, but through collapse. Soldiers refused to surface, refused to obey, or simply wandered into captivity, numb and expressionless. American psychological units later documented this phenomenon. They called it combat exhaustion, but among German prisoners it manifested differently, as total resignation. Many POWs interviewed after capture said the same thing. It was the artillery. Not the tanks, not the aircraft, the artillery. This was the psychological victory of American firepower. It didn't merely kill, it made survival itself intolerable. The leadership angle. Command in the age of fire. For Allied commanders, artillery was not support. It was strategy. Generals like Omar Bradley, Courtney Hodges, and William Simpson of the Ninth Army believed in systematic destruction before movement. Every attack began with a map, a timetable, and an artillery plan. Infantry advanced only when every target within range had been shelled into silence. The command philosophy was simple. Let the guns win the ground before the men take it. Fire coordination centers received intelligence not only from forward observers, but from aerial reconnaissance and intercepted German communications. Targets were plotted, adjusted, and cross-checked before the first shell left the barrel. The process was clinical, almost surgical. This approach turned battlefields into orchestrated landscapes of destruction. American commanders could walk into an operations tent, point at a map, and say, "This village at 0600, and watch as entire batteries recalibrated within minutes. German leadership, by contrast, was paralyzed. Field. Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, was known for his toughness. Hitler called him the Führer's fireman. But even he could not fight invisible enemies. His staff reports from April 1945 are filled with despair. Our lines are no longer lines. Artillery strikes prevent all movement. Orders cannot be delivered. Units exist only in name. When communication broke down, so did control. German officers could no longer reach their battalions. By the time an order to counterattack was issued, the units it was meant for no longer existed. The Americans, meanwhile, had learned to adapt on the move. Artillery liaisons embedded directly with infantry units carried portable radios, allowing real-time adjustments during combat. It was a revolution in command, decentralization through trust and communication. The result was relentless efficiency. Every skirmish, every movement, every attempted breakout met with the same fate: coordinated annihilation. The moral angle. When power becomes terror. There is an uncomfortable truth beneath all technological triumphs: the cost paid by human souls. Even among American gunners, the experience of mass destruction carried a heavy psychological weight. They rarely saw their enemy, but they knew what their shells did. When captured, Germans were brought in afterward. Dazed, burned, their hearing gone. Many American artillerymen admitted a strange disquiet. Captain John L. Gibson of the 78th Infantry Division later wrote, "It was efficient, but it wasn't war the way we imagined it. You never saw the man you killed. You only knew he was somewhere out there when you stopped hearing his guns." The ethical line between necessary force and annihilation blurred. Artillery had become so powerful that surrender itself was often an act of mercy, both given and received. German soldiers approaching Allied lines with white cloths were rarely fired upon. They were led to the rear, given food, and interrogated. Many expressing gratitude simply to be alive. Some even asked to remain, where American shells could not reach them. For the commanders who orchestrated this destruction, it was a paradox. Their success depended on overwhelming power. Yet that same power revealed the deepest fragility of warfare: the human mind's inability to endure limitless terror. By the spring of 1945, that terror had hollowed the Wehrmacht from within. The soldiers still carried rifles. They still wore the eagle and swastika. But inside, they were already defeated. And when the Allied advance encircled the Ruhr pocket in April, that inner collapse would finally meet its physical end. Tens of thousands would lay down their arms, not in betrayal, but in deliverance. The artillery had done what no speech, no negotiation, no ideology could. It broke the will to fight. The Ruhr pocket, Germany, April 1945. The final act of the Western Front had begun. The Rhine had been crossed. The German army, once feared across Europe, was collapsing into chaos. Yet in the industrial heartland of the Ruhr, a vast pocket of resistance still remained. Over 300,000 soldiers of Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model, trapped between the U.S. First and Ninth Armies. For Adolf Hitler, the Ruhr was not just a battlefield, it was symbolic. It was Germany's industrial soul, the birthplace of its armaments, steel and coal. Losing it meant losing the ability to fight. For Model, the order was clear: hold the Ruhr to the last man. But the Americans had no intention of storming the Ruhr in direct combat. They didn't need to. They would bury it. Encirclement. By early April, the jaws of the encirclement were closing. From the north, General William H. Simpson's Ninth Army drove down from the Wesel bridgehead. From the south, Courtney Hodges' First Army pushed north from Remagen. Between them lay a dense cluster of cities: Essen, Dortmund, Wuppertal, Hagen, all filled with factories, workers, and retreating German troops. The Wehrmacht tried to form defensive lines along rivers and ridges, but each attempt ended the same way. American artillery fire preceded every movement, every bridge crossing, every attempted stand. Reconnaissance aircraft circled constantly, mapping German concentrations. Within minutes of detection, the fire orders went out. The American 155mm long tom guns thundered day and night. Each shell carried 100 pounds of high explosive and could reach targets over 14 miles away. The barrages came in patterns: first the roads, then the crossroads, then the command posts. Ammunition dumps vanished. Entire columns were wiped out before they could deploy. Civilians fled by the thousands, clogging the roads, which made perfect targets. When the artillery fell, it didn't distinguish. To those trapped within, the Ruhr became an inferno of concussive thunder. The collapse of Command Model tried to restore order, issuing directives to form a new defensive perimeter around Dortmund. But the messages never reached their destinations. Communication lines were shattered. Field telephones had long gone dead. Runners disappeared in shell fire before they could deliver orders. German units, already reduced to half strength, fought in isolation. Companies no longer knew where their battalions were. The maps in headquarters tents were meaningless now, covered in inked arrows pointing toward chaos. Every German staff report carried the same refrain: artillery fire constant. Units dispersed. Impossible to regroup. The Americans were not advancing recklessly. They were advancing methodically, step by step, under a protective wall of fire. Each time resistance flared, it was crushed by massed bombardment. One U.S. division could call upon the guns of 4 others within range. The Ruhr became a laboratory for coordinated destruction. And when the guns ceased, loudspeakers broadcast surrender demands. Leaflets fell from the sky, promising fair treatment for those who laid down their arms. More and more German soldiers began to take the offer. Not because they were cowards, but because they were broken. The reality of the barrage. To those inside the pocket, the world had become sound and vibration. The sky flashed without pause. Men lost track of time. They lived between explosions, measuring hours by the rhythm of artillery fire. A corporal of the 3rd Parachute Division later described the experience. You could not tell if it was night or day. The air was so thick with dust, you could not see the man next to you. When the guns stopped, your ears rang, and you felt like your own body was still shaking. The psychological effect was catastrophic. American military doctors who later examined German POWs found symptoms of shock, hysteria, and disassociation. Many could not respond to questions or follow simple commands. Others suffered temporary blindness or deafness from concussion, without a single wound on their bodies. Artillery had become a weapon not just of destruction, but of psychological domination. The human breaking point. On April 10, 1945, the pocket fully closed near Dortmund. The Ruhr was cut off from the rest of Germany. No supplies, no reinforcements, only fire. Model's subordinates urged him to authorize surrender. He refused, insisting that Army Group B would fight as long as ammunition lasts. But by then, ammunition no longer mattered. The American guns didn't need a decisive battle. They simply waited, firing whenever movement was detected, letting the encircled army suffocate under steel and fear. Across the front, white flags began to appear. First by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Entire regiments approached the American lines, unarmed, hands raised, their faces gray with exhaustion. Some had walked for miles through their own destroyed positions. Others had carried wounded comrades through cratered roads, only to surrender upon reaching the first American outpost. One U.S. intelligence officer recorded the moment bluntly. They came not as enemies defeated, but as men relieved to have survived hell. The battle for the Ruhr had become less a fight than a release. The inevitable surrender of men who had reached the limits of endurance. Yet, deep inside the pocket, one man still refused to accept it. Walter Model, Hitler's fireman of the Reich, would not lay down his arms. The next stage of this tragedy would not be written by artillery, but by the final decision of a general who chose death over surrender. April 12, 1945. The thunder of guns was fading now, not because the Americans had run out of shells, but because there was nothing left to hit. Smoke blanketed the Ruhr Valley. Cities once known for their factories and furnaces were now vast plains of rubble. Essen, Bochum, Hagen, all silent but for the rumble of distant artillery echoing off the ruins. Inside what remained of his headquarters near Duisburg, Field Marshal Walter Model sat in the dim light of a kerosene lamp. His uniform was soiled from weeks of retreat, his face hollow from sleepless nights. Maps of the Ruhr lay on the table before him, thick with red arrows showing Allied advances from every direction. Army Group B, once nearly 500,000 strong, was gone. Model's staff officers had stopped pretending. Reports came in not of battles, but of surrenders. Entire divisions, the 116th Panzer, the 9th Panzer, the 15th Infantry, were laying down arms en masse. U.S. officers estimated over 50,000 prisoners in just 2 days. Columns of German soldiers marched under guard toward the west, weapons discarded, white flags tied to rifle barrels. And yet, even in total collapse, the Americans kept their guns ready. Any remaining strong point that resisted was shelled into. Submission before infantry closed in. The death of Command Model refused to sign a surrender order. He argued that the German soldiers in the Ruhr should decide for themselves, to fight or to give up. But even that choice had been taken from him. His radio transmitters had gone silent. His lines to Berlin were dead. He was a field marshal without an army, a commander of ghosts. When Allied patrols approached his headquarters near Lintorf, he dismissed his staff. He ordered the destruction of documents and the evacuation of civilians still nearby. Then, according to surviving witnesses, he stepped outside into the woods with a pistol in his hand. A single shot ended his command. Model had been loyal to his soldiers until the end. He refused to abandon them in words, but in death he acknowledged what reality had already declared, that the war was lost. The surrender. The next morning, April 13th, the first major capitulations began. Near Hagen, elements of the 116th Panzer Division surrendered to the U.S. 95th Infantry Division. By evening, entire corps formations followed, each under its own officers, each arriving with vehicles, horses, and wagons in disarray. The Americans were stunned not by the number of prisoners, but by their condition. Many arrived barefoot, their uniforms caked with mud and soot. Some carried wounded comrades on makeshift stretchers. Few spoke. They simply raised their hands and waited. U.S. Lieutenant Harold Connors, witnessing the scene outside Dortmund, later wrote, "They were done. They weren't fighting men anymore. They were survivors, nothing else. You could see it in their faces. That look when a man's soul has already left the battlefield." By April 15th, more than 150,000 German soldiers had surrendered. Within another week, the total reached over 317,000. One of the largest mass capitulations in military history. The sheer scale overwhelmed the American command structure. Temporary enclosures were hastily built across open fields to hold the prisoners. Yet, remarkably, the transition was almost orderly. There were no riots, no last stands. The Germans marched quietly, obediently, even gratefully. Some cried, others simply slept, collapsing into the dirt the moment they reached safety. It was as if an entire army had exhaled. The guns fall silent. When the last German strongpoints in the Ruhr surrendered, the American guns, the very instruments that had broken the Wehrmacht, finally fell silent. For many artillerymen, it was the first true quiet they'd known in months. Battery commanders stood beside their guns in disbelief. They had fired hundreds of thousands of shells since Normandy. Day after day, night after night, often without ever seeing the enemy. Now, they watched lines of prisoners stretching to the horizon and understood what that power had done. Private Jack Heller of the Ninth Army recalled, "We didn't cheer. Nobody did. We just watched them coming. Thousands of them. And it felt strange. You realized this wasn't victory. It was what was left after victory. The devastation of the Ruhr was nearly total. Bridges lay in ruins. Railways were twisted steel. Entire towns were reduced to foundations. In the words of one Allied engineer, it looked like the moon, lifeless, gray, and silent. For the German civilians who survived, surrender was both liberation and humiliation. For the soldiers, it was survival stripped of honor. But for the Americans, for the men behind the artillery sights, it was confirmation of what modern war had become. A battle fought not between soldiers, but between technology and endurance. The turning point complete. With the Ruhr pocket destroyed, the last organized resistance west of the Elbe collapsed. Within 3 weeks, the rest of Germany followed. On May 8, 1945, the guns of Europe fell silent for good. But the seeds of that silence had been planted here, in the industrial valley where 50,000 men had chosen surrender over the certainty of death by shellfire. The battlefield of the Ruhr was not won through courage, nor maneuver, nor even overwhelming numbers. It was won through relentless precision, through a doctrine that turned artillery from a weapon into an inevitability. The war had entered a new age, one where endurance alone could not save a soldier, and surrender became the last act of survival. The sound of those last barrages still echoed across the Rhine long after the surrender, and in that echo lay the full weight of the modern battlefield. Mechanical, merciless, and absolute. The battle for the Ruhr ended not with a triumphant assault or a dramatic last stand, but with a silence so vast it unsettled even the victors. When the guns stopped, what remained of Germany's industrial heartland resembled a landscape erased by time. From the air, reconnaissance pilots described it as a gray wound stretching across the western plains, a sprawl of shattered factories, burned-out locomotives, and endless columns of men marching west under guard. The Ruhr, once the engine of Hitler's war machine, had ceased to exist as an instrument of war. For the Allies, this was more than a military victory. It was a strategic decapitation. The Ruhr Valley, responsible for nearly 40% of Germany's pre-war industrial output, was now under American control. Its coal mines, steel mills, and synthetic fuel plants, the very infrastructure that had fed the Wehrmacht's tanks and aircraft, were destroyed or captured intact. Without it, the German army was little more than a fragmented force, fighting on borrowed time. The logistics of surrender. The sudden influx of prisoners was staggering. Between April 10 and April 24, 1945, U.S. forces took an estimated 317,000 German soldiers captive in the Ruhr pocket alone, more than the number surrendered at Stalingrad 2 years earlier. It was, by every measure, one of the largest mass capitulations in modern history. Managing such numbers required an unprecedented logistical effort. The Americans hastily erected temporary enclosures, open fields surrounded by barbed wire, to house tens of thousands at a time. Known as Rheinwiesenlager or Rhine Meadow Camps, these makeshift prisons stretched across the Rhine's western banks. There were no barracks, no real shelters, only the open sky and the muddy ground. The sudden thaw of spring rains turned the fields into quagmires. Food and medical supplies were limited. Many prisoners fell ill, weakened by months of malnutrition and exhaustion. Yet, even in these harsh conditions, there was no organized resistance. The German soldiers, stripped of weapons and authority, simply waited. For food, for transport, for an end to something that had already ended. The psychological toll was immense. Men who had fought across Russia, Normandy, and the Ardennes now found themselves powerless. Officers and enlisted alike stood in the same lines, indistinguishable except for faded rank insignia. One U.S. Army chaplain wrote, "They didn't look defeated, just hollow, as if their souls had been shelled out of them." The collapse of the Western Front. With the Ruhr gone, the German Western Front disintegrated almost overnight. South of the pocket, Patton's Third Army surged into Bavaria. North of it, Montgomery's 21st Army Group pushed toward the North Sea. What had once been an intricate defensive network, the West Wall, was now a memory, bypassed or obliterated by firepower and momentum. The German High Command in Berlin could no longer pretend to control events. Messages from the front grew sporadic, then ceased altogether. In the capital, Hitler's inner circle still spoke of miracle weapons and counterattacks that would never come. The Ruhr's fall was more than a defeat. It was proof that Germany's war machine had bled out from the inside. By mid-April, American units were already crossing the Elbe River, less than 100 kilometers from Berlin. The Soviets, advancing from the east, had reached the Oder. The Third Reich, once spanning from the Pyrenees to the Volga, was now reduced to a series of isolated collapsing pockets. For the soldiers, for the German infantrymen who surrendered in the Ruhr, the war had ended in a haze of exhaustion, fear, and disbelief. Most had been fighting since Normandy or the Ardennes, moving from one hopeless defensive line to the next. They were not cowards. They were survivors of a system that had run out of fuel, food, and purpose. For the Americans who faced them, the sight of mass surrender brought conflicting emotions. Relief, certainly, but also a sobering realization of what modern warfare had become. The artillerymen, who had unleashed the barrages that shattered the German lines, rarely spoke of it afterward. As one U.S. gunner wrote home, "It wasn't bravery that won here. It was the math of destruction." The Ruhr campaign was not a battle of heroism or daring. It was the final, inevitable result of total war. The moment when firepower replaced maneuver, when surrender became the only escape from annihilation. And yet, the end of one front was not the end of the war's consequences. The question now shifted. What would victory cost in peace? When the Ruhr pocket finally vanished from Allied maps, Europe's industrial heart had been silenced, not just for the war, but for a generation. The physical ruins could be rebuilt, but the moral and human wreckage would last much longer. The human landscape of defeat. In the weeks that followed the surrender, Allied correspondents entered the Ruhr Valley. What they found was beyond anything they had seen in Normandy or the Ardennes. Entire towns, Gelsenkirchen, Wuppertal, Oberhausen, were hollowed shells. Bridges lay in rivers, roofs were gone from every factory, and twisted rail cars rusted in the open. The air itself smelled of burnt metal and wet ash. The people of the Ruhr, once the proud workers of Germany's mightiest industrial complex, now scavenged for food among the wreckage of their own production lines. Women carried water from broken mains in helmets. Children wandered between abandoned Panther hulls, their tracks sunk deep into the mud. To the west, the U.S. Army's military police kept watch over endless lines of German POWs being moved toward holding camps near Remagen, Andernach, and Sinzig. From a distance, they looked less like soldiers and more like refugees of their own army. The irony was complete. The men who had fought to defend the factories of the Reich were now its last prisoners, swallowed by the very ground they had fought for. Allied reflections among the Allied command, the Ruhr campaign was hailed as a masterpiece of coordination. Generals Omar Bradley and Courtney Hodges described it as the cleanest encirclement of the Western Front. Dwight Eisenhower, looking at aerial photographs of the pocket, remarked quietly to his staff, "This was the real death blow to Hitler's war." But not everyone celebrated. Within the U.S. Army, many officers saw the Ruhr's destruction as a grim prophecy. The efficiency of artillery, the industrial precision of death, revealed what future wars could become. The American doctrine of mass fire had worked flawlessly, but its success was haunting. Divisions equipped with radios, spotter planes, and heavy guns had demonstrated that human courage alone no longer decided wars. The battlefield had evolved into something mechanical, an environment where survival depended on technology, not valor. One after-action report from the Ninth Army concluded bluntly, "Future warfare will not rely on the bayonet or the bullet, but on the weight of steel delivered at distance." That prediction would echo decades later in Korea, in Vietnam, in every conflict where artillery and air power became the deciding voices. The fate of the captives for the 300,000 German prisoners taken in the Ruhr, the war's end brought only uncertainty. Many were transferred to France or Britain for labor. Some, especially younger conscripts, were released by late 1945, but thousands remained in captivity for years, their return delayed by politics and logistics. Few spoke of the artillery afterward. For them, the experience was too consuming to describe. Men who had endured years on the Eastern Front claimed that nothing, not even Soviet shelling, matched the sustained precision of the American bombardments. Letters smuggled from camps tell of men waking in the night, hearing phantom barrages, ducking for cover at the sound of thunder. The trauma of the Ruhr was not visible, but it lived on, a memory carved into the nerves of every survivor. Germany's broken core economically, the loss of the Ruhr marked the final collapse of Nazi Germany's ability to sustain war. Without its coal and steel, remaining forces in Bavaria and Saxony could not maintain fuel, transport, or ammunition. Hitler's hopes for a last stand evaporated as the Allies advanced on all fronts. When Berlin fell on May the 2nd, the soldiers who had once fought in the Ruhr were scattered across Europe. Prisoners, refugees, or corpses buried under collapsed bunkers. The Reich had not fallen in one climactic moment. It had bled out slowly, one factory, one bridge, one battery at a time. The Ruhr was its heart, and the Americans had stopped it from beating. By the summer of 1945, reconstruction teams surveyed the valley, noting the extent of devastation. One engineer wrote simply in his report, "Nothing here stands without purpose. Not the ruins, not the silence, not the graves." The Ruhr's story was not one of glorious defeat or triumphant victory. It was a study in inevitability, the moment when industrial warfare reached its absolute conclusion. And in that realization lay the true aftermath, a world forced to confront the cost of its own progress. The guns had fallen silent, but their echo would shape how humanity fought and feared ever after. The fall of the Ruhr was not merely the end of a battle. It was the end of an era. In that shattered valley, beneath the smoke of burned factories and splintered trees, the modern age of warfare revealed its true face. For centuries, victory had been measured in courage, in maneuver, in the will of men. But in the spring of 1945, courage had no defense against mathematics, against the precise calculation of range, angle, and explosive yield. The battlefield had become an equation, and every German soldier in the Ruhr was caught within its formula. 50,000 men chose surrender, not because they lacked bravery, but because bravery had lost its meaning. Under the relentless hammering of American artillery, survival became the only act left to perform. This was the lesson of the Ruhr, that technology, once created to protect, would eventually replace the human element entirely. The roar of the guns had proven louder than the voice of any general, stronger than any oath to fight to the last. And when the last shell fell, the silence that followed was not peace. It was realization. Realization that war had crossed a threshold, that destruction could now be measured not in courage, but in tonnage, not in blood spilled by men, but in steel rained from miles away. The soldiers who walked out of that forest, hands raised, were not cowards. They were witnesses. Witnesses to the moment when the age of man gave way to the age of machines. In the decades that followed, nations would study the Ruhr and learn its cold arithmetic. Firepower would become policy. Precision would become doctrine. And war, stripped of its illusions, would never look the same again. The echoes of those barrages, the thunder that made 50,000 men surrender, still linger in the annals of history, not as a symbol of defeat, but as a warning that there comes a point when power outgrows purpose, when the tools we create to win wars remind us why they should never be fought again.